It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and you're listening to another episode of Monster Mondays presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays, well, they're for me to talk about monster movies. I've mentioned them before back in the Hellboy 2004 episode, and they are back just as nasty as ever. Those damn dirty Nazis. One of our culture's most popular myths that are absolutely based in fact is that Hitler's political party looked for any and all advantage to spread across the world. Whether it was through occult means or scientific research, it seems the Nazis were up to some pretty treacherous shit. And that's the focus of this week's Monster Mondays, the JJ Abrams produced Overlord from 2018. The movie begins with a fleet of American planes readying for an invasion of paratroopers into France. Now, this isn't quite like any old invasion. It's actually the day before D-Day, the day that historically the Allied forces made an incredible push into the Western Front of the German strongholds in France that gave them the ability to gain the eventual foothold to liberate Europe and defeat Germany. Unfortunately, this plane carrying our main characters, Sergeant Renson, Corporal Ford, and soldiers Boyce, Tibbet, Chase, and Dawson, is shot down before they reach their planned jump point. They eventually reunite after Renson is discovered by some German troops and killed. And later, as they're walking through a field, Dawson is killed by a landmine. Their mission is to knock out a radio installation that's found in and around an old church in a small French village. The survivors, Ford, Boyce, Tibbet, and Chase, find a village girl named Chloe and soon discover the gross shit going on in the church in a lab that's kind of secretly kept underneath the installation. She lives in this town, in this occupied German town, it's a German-occupied French town, I guess you could say, with her little brother and her aunt. And her aunt is actually quite disfigured from the experiments the Nazis are doing in that lab that they've built. Boyce and Chloe quickly become friends, mostly because he can speak fluidly in French and was pretty nice to her from the beginning. And she also speaks pretty decent English, for a French girl in this small town. When her house is inspected by the Germans, Boyce is no fan of the captain of the German battalion that's there, attempting to rape Chloe. So he does something about it. And in doing so, it kind of tips off the German captain's, it kind of brings to his attention that these American soldiers are there, forcing Ford to knock out the captain and be pretty pissed at Boyce for straying from the mission of laying low and moving on the radio installation at the church. Now, speaking of the church and the radio installation, it's pretty heavily fortified, and when Boyce is checking out the situation, he sees some of the Nazi soldiers with the main scientist bring some deformed people out of the fortification and burn them with flamethrowers. When Boyce sneaks into the base through the back of a truck, kind of carrying in some dead people for them to experiment with, he hears some strange noises from behind a giant wall, and when he looks inside, something looks back at him. When he goes deeper into the church, he finds a lab full of nasty, oozy stuff with jars of slimy things and bags that appear to have something inside them that moves. And when he opens one of the bags, there seems to be almost like a person inside it, kind of cocooned. He also sees a woman's head that is only attached to her spine, and both of these people basically beg for help from Boyce, but he has to keep moving. He does eventually find some syringes with some kind of orangish red stuff in them and decides to pocket one. And he then witnesses a dead man that's been put on a slab starting to move around again when he was injected with that serum that was in the syringe that he took. And he actually is able to save another guy who's on a slab from basically suffering the same fate. And as it turns out, the guy that he saves was another American soldier that was part of the invasion battalion. Now, back at Chloe's place, Ford kind of beats on the Nazi captain a little bit for not really telling him what the serum is for and what's inside that syringe that Boyce took. When the men gear up to make a run at the installation where the radio tower is, the Nazi captain attempts to escape and fatally wounds Chase. Just out of desperation, Boyce gives Chase the serum, which does bring him back to life. He's strong, he doesn't feel pain, but he's acting a little weird. And eventually his body distorts and things get relatively troubling until Ford is forced to shoot him and try to kill him. But that's when they learn that a 1,000-year Reich needs 1,000-year soldiers. Chase gets back up and keeps coming until he can finally be put down by Boyce, essentially just kind of beating him over the head constantly until there was nothing left of him. When the captain sees an opportunity to actually escape after that, he is able to grab Chloe's brother, and it forces the remaining soldiers to have to move now, because now the Nazi captain is going to be able to tell everybody that, you know, that the Americans are there, and they've kind of lost the element of surprise. Ford demands that they stick to their orders, but Boyce defies orders and says they really need to destroy the church and the lab. And Ford eventually kind of understands that, you know, whatever they're creating down there, it needs to be destroyed. So it's time to take down the target and destroy all the evil science lab stuff. Now, the Nazi captain, after taking a bullet to the face from Ford, is still living. And he's still kind of moving on, but through the pain, I guess. He takes a couple of doses of the serum, which had yet to be tested on living people. Now, Chloe eventually finds her brother and also learns that fire is a pretty good deterrent for these Nazi monsters that are running around. While Boyce and Ford set the place to blow up, they still have to deal with the monsterized captain and the evil scientist separately. The scientist isn't so tough to deal with. Boyce is able to really kind of dispatch him. The captain, well, he's a fucking monster, so he proves to be a little bit tougher for Ford. But let's just say that in the end, you don't see any Nazi monsters still running around, so the good guys do end up winning and are able to take out the radio tower to eventually make D-Day successful. So let's get to my 3 things that I enjoyed about Overlord. First up, the opening scene featuring the plane with our main characters and it being shot down is pretty incredible, really. A big chunk of the opening scene was featured in the trailers, but it's incredibly well shot and constructed. JJ Abrams is definitely a student of Steven Spielberg, and it's obvious that he kind of has a hand in creating this scene. And it really kind of feels like he's helping recreate the same feel of Saving Private Ryan, which in that opening scene, which takes place on D-Day when they're kind of landing and people, you know, having to deal with the barrage of bullets and the mortars and so forth. And that actually taking place on D-Day. So I guess you could say that Overlord is a prequel to Saving Private Ryan. But seriously, as good as this movie is at being a horror movie, it's also a very effective war movie, too. From when the plane is taken down to when Dawson unexpectedly steps on a landmine and blows up, you're lulled into a sense of things being tense but not hopeless to suddenly being tossed into complete and utter chaos. It reminds me of a little bit of something like Predator in the way that it starts as one thing and then the insane is cranked up and you got monsters and shit running amok. Second, to piggyback a little bit more off my first point, I like that this is not your typical run-of-the-mill zombies. Yes, they're reanimated corpses, but they're not your typical shambling type. They are faster. Also, it seems that they are more like the types of rage-filled monsters that was seen in something like 28 Days Later. So they are basically animals who can't be killed or taken down without a great deal of energy expended. It does make me wonder how the Nazis planned on controlling these things. I mean, they seem pretty strong, pretty pissed off, and generally willing to eat and kill anything German or otherwise. So I guess that's part of the phase 2 of this whole project, but what do I know? Lastly, and this is somewhat minor, but I actually reacted somewhat viscerally to it. So you've got the good guys trying to blow up the bad guys stuff, right? Well, Ford, through all this movie, is kind of a jerk, but pretty much a badass. Yeah, he's a little too focused on the mission first and everything else, including his own guys second. I mean, yeah, I get it. That's kind of, you kind of have to make those sacrifices to make the plan work. But, and you certainly don't sacrifice the mission that helps bunches for the good of a few people or an individual. That plays all the way through to the end. That's not really where I'm going with this, but really he's kind of setting up his charges to blow that Nazi lab to shit. And in comes the monster Nazi captain, whose name is Waffner. And his face is all gross from his wound, but he's not entirely uncontrollable. He is definitely pissed off, but he's still thinking as he normally would, even though he's now got a couple of doses of the monster making serum in him. And he picks up Ford and hangs him by his torso on a big old hook. Now that made me cringe because that always seems like something in a movie that makes me kind of go, ooh, that seems like that would hurt. But it actually gets worse. When Boyce comes in and distracts Waffner, Ford has to pull himself off that hook. As you do when you're being a total badass. But the first time he doesn't have enough oomph to get free. So it seems like when he kind of lifts himself up and he can't get over the hook and he kind of lays himself back down onto the hook, it seems like it goes a little deeper into his body. I mean, he still has the energy to pull himself up and off that hook with the second try. That was tough to watch, but effective as all get out. That's just one of those little things that you see in a horror movie or in an action movie that it really kind of makes you feel it. This guy is a badass who doesn't want to stray from the mission, but when the cards were on the table, he's going to do some awesome shit. Overall, I really liked Overlord. It's one I wish I had seen in the theater when it was out to support a smaller horror movie that relies so much more on having this whole other side of it with the war movie stuff and the characters and the end goal. It's hard to find horror that wants to take its time like this one does. It's not a slow burn at all because it still has the war movie side of it, but it doesn't once fall into the trappings of jump scares and music stings to get cheap fright. So I would definitely check it out. It's kind of like, with a runtime of an hour and 50 minutes, it's kind of like watching two movies. You get half a movie that's a pretty decent war movie. You get a half of a movie that's a pretty decent horror movie. And together, it just works out really well. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you around. And don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com. Also, make sure that you check out new posts on my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday.